Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we start today's case, I want to ask for your support by subscribing to my channel. Your support is very important to me, so please subscribe to follow more cases and encourage us. Click the like button and let's get into the case. The gentle hum of the boat's engine filled the air as Gunnar Magnusson carefully stowed the last of his diving gear. His weathered hands moved with practiced ease, securing each piece of equipment in its designated spot. The small vessel rocked, gently beneath his feet, a familiar and comforting motion he'd known since childhood. As he worked, Gunnar's eyes frequently drifted to the horizon, where the last remnants of daylight were fading. The sky was transforming, deep blues giving way to a tapestry of purples and greens. The first hints of the aurora borealis were beginning to dance across the heavens, promising a spectacular display for the night ahead. A cool breeze ruffled Gunnar's salt and pepper hair as he paused to take in the view. At 52, he was no longer the young, reckless diver he'd once been, but his passion for the sea remained undiminished. Tonight's dive was special, a chance to harvest scallops under the ethereal glow of the northern lights. It was an opportunity too tempting to pass up despite the late hour and the chill in the air. "Gunnar, are you still out there?" The voice of his wife, Inga, carried from the small dock where their house perched on the rocky coastline. Gunnar turned, raising a hand in acknowledgement. Inga stood at the edge of the wooden planks, her arms wrapped tightly around herself against the growing cold. "Just finishing up, Elskan," Gunnar called back, using the endearment that still made Inga smile after 30 years of marriage. "I'll be heading out soon." Inga's brow furrowed with concern. "Are you sure about this, Gunnar? It's getting late, and you know how quickly the weather can turn out there." Gunnar made his way across the gently swaying deck to where the boat was moored. He reached out, taking Inga's hand in his own. Her fingers were cold, and he rubbed them gently between his palms. "Don't worry," he said, his voice low and reassuring. "I've done this dive 100 times, and look at that sky. It's going to be magnificent out there tonight." Inga's eyes softened, but the worry didn't fully leave her face. I know. You're as much a part of these waters as the fish themselves, but promise me, you'll be careful, yes? No unnecessary risks." Gunnar leaned in, placing a gentle kiss on her forehead. "I promise. I'll be back before you know it, with enough scallops for that chowder you've been craving." A small smile tugged at Inga's lips. "Well, in that case, I suppose I can't object too strongly. But if you're not back by morning, I'm sending out the entire Coast Guard to find you." Gunnar chuckled, giving Inga's hand a final squeeze before releasing it. "Deal. Now go inside where it's warm. I'll see you soon." As Inga made her way back to the house, Gunnar returned to his final preparations. He double-checked his oxygen tanks, ensuring they were fully charged. His wetsuit, a new model with reflective patches for improved visibility, lay neatly folded next to his gear. The material was designed to catch and reflect even the faintest light, a crucial safety feature for night diving. Gunnar glanced at his watch. It was later than he'd initially planned, but the conditions were perfect. The sea was calm, with only a gentle swell that wouldn't interfere with his dive, and above, the aurora was growing stronger by the minute, sheets of green light shimmering and undulating across the star-studded sky. As he changed into his wetsuit, Gunnar ran through his mental checklist one last time. Tanks check, regulator check, dive computer check, emergency beacon check. He'd been diving these waters for decades, but complacency was a diver's worst enemy. Every precaution was necessary, no matter how routine the dive might seem. With everything secure, Gunnar started the boat's engine. The familiar rumble vibrated through the hull as he carefully maneuvered away from the dock. He caught a final glimpse of Inga watching from the kitchen window, her silhouette framed by warm, golden light. Gunnar raised his hand in a final farewell before turning his attention to the open water ahead. The cove where Gunnar planned to dive was about 20 minutes from the harbor. As he guided the boat through the dark waters, his excitement grew. The aurora was in full display now, great swathes of green and purple light dancing across the sky. The lights reflected off the water's surface, creating an otherworldly scene that never failed to take Gunnar's breath away. "Magnificent," he murmured to himself, drinking in the spectacle. Nights like these made every cold, difficult dive worth it. It was more than just a job or a hobby. It was a communion with nature in its most awe-inspiring form. As he neared the cove, Gunnar reduced the boat's speed. He knew these waters like the back of his hand, but nighttime navigation always required extra caution. The cove was sheltered, its waters calm and rich with marine life. It was a perfect spot for scallops, and Gunnar had enjoyed many successful harvests here over the years. Gunnar cut the engine as he entered the cove, allowing the boat to drift to a stop. The sudden silence was profound, broken only by the gentle lapping of waves against the hull and the distant cry of a seabird. He dropped anchor, feeling the satisfying tug as it caught on the seabed below. For a moment, Gunnar stood still, taking in his surroundings. The cliffs of the cove rose around him, their dark silhouettes stark against the shimmering sky. The water was black as ink, reflecting the dancing lights above like a mirror. It was a scene of wild, untamed beauty that never failed to stir something deep in Gunnar's soul. With practiced efficiency, Gunnar began his final preparations. He checked his dive computer one last time, confirming the water temperature and adjusting his suit accordingly. The water would be cold. It always was in these northern seas, but his wetsuit would keep him warm enough for the dive. As he prepared to don his tank and fins, a flicker of movement in the water caught Gunnar's eye. He paused, peering into the darkness. For a moment he thought he saw a large shape moving beneath the surface, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. Probably just a seal, Gunnar muttered to himself, shaking off a sudden, inexplicable chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Seals were common in these waters, and they were often curious about divers. Still, a nagging sense of unease settled in the pit of his stomach. Gunnar hesitated, his hand resting on the oxygen tank. Inga's worried face flashed in his mind, along with her parting words, "No unnecessary risks." Was he being reckless, diving alone at night? Should he head back and return in the daylight? He looked up at the sky, where the aurora continued its mesmerizing dance. The lights seemed to pulse and swirl, as if beckoning him into the water. Gunnar took a deep breath, steeling his resolve. He was an experienced diver, and he'd taken every precaution. The conditions were perfect, and opportunities like this were rare. "Come on, old man," he said aloud, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet cove. "You didn't come all this way to turn back now." Decision made, Gunnar efficiently donned the rest of his gear. The familiar weight of the tank settled on his back, and he tightened the straps with practiced movements. He seated his mask firmly, adjusting it for a perfect seal. Finally, he slipped on his fins, gripping the edge of the boat for balance. Before making his final descent, Gunnar activated his emergency beacon. It was standard procedure for solo dives, a silent signal of his location that would alert authorities if he didn't return on schedule. The small device blinked reassuringly, a tiny red light in the vast darkness. Gunnar took one last look at the aurora-lit sky, filling his lungs with the crisp, salty air. Then, with a quiet prayer to whatever gods watched over foolish old divers, he stepped off the edge of the boat and slipped beneath the surface of the black water. The shock of cold was immediate, despite his wetsuit. Gunnar exhaled slowly, allowing his body to adjust to the temperature. He flicked on his dive light, the powerful beam cutting through the murky water. Streams of bubbles rose around him as he descended, the surface world fading away with each meter. As Gunnar sank deeper, the familiar underwater landscape of the cove began to take shape. Rocky outcroppings loomed in the darkness, their surfaces teeming with life. Schools of small fish darted away from his light, their scales glinting like tiny mirrors. In the distance, he could make out the seafloor, where he knew the scallop. Beds awaited. The descent was smooth and controlled, Gunnar's experienced hands making minute adjustments to his buoyancy. He kept a careful eye on his dive computer, monitoring his depth and air supply. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned, yet Gunnar couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The water felt different somehow, charged with an energy he couldn't quite explain. As he neared the bottom, Gunnar swept his light across the seafloor. The beam caught the distinctive shapes of scallop shells half buried in the sand. A smile tugged at his lips behind his mask. It looked like it would be a good harvest after all. Gunnar touched down gently on the seafloor, stirring up small clouds of silt. He unclipped the collection bag from his belt, its mesh material billowing slightly in the gentle current. With practiced movements, he began to gather the scallops, his trained eye quickly distinguishing the mature specimens from those too small to harvest. Time seemed to lose meaning as Gunnar worked. The rhythmic sound of his breathing and the occasional crackle of sand beneath his knees were the only sounds in the underwater silence. His bag slowly filled with scallops, their shells clicking softly against each other. It was as Gunnar reached for a particularly large scallop that he felt it, a vibration in the water, so low and deep that he felt it more than heard it. He froze, his hand hovering above the shell. Every instinct honed by years in the sea suddenly screamed danger. Slowly Gunnar turned, sweeping his light in a wide arc. The beam caught nothing but empty water and swirling particles. Yet the feeling of being watched, of some vast presence, lurking just beyond the reach of his light, was overwhelming. Heart pounding, Gunnar began to rise from the seafloor. His movements were slow and deliberate, careful not to make any sudden motions that might attract attention. The collection bag hung heavy at his side, but Gunnar barely noticed its weight. Every sense was on high alert, straining to detect any sign of threat in the oppressive darkness. As he ascended, Gunnar's eyes darted constantly between his surroundings and his dive computer. He was about halfway to the surface when he heard it, a haunting, melodic call that seemed to reverberate through the water. It was a sound Gunnar had heard before, but never this close, never with such clarity. Orca. The realization hit Gunnar like a physical blow. Orcas were not uncommon in these waters, but they generally stayed far offshore. To encounter one in the cove, especially at night, was virtually unheard of. Gunnar's ascent became more urgent, his powerful legs kicking with renewed strength. The surface seemed impossibly far away, a faint shimmer of aurora-lit water that refused to draw closer. The orca's call came again, closer this time. Gunnar thought he could detect a note of curiosity in the haunting sound. Or was it hunger? Gunnar's heart pounded in his chest as he descended into the inky depths of the cove. The water grew colder and darker with each meter, enveloping him in an alien world far removed from the aurora-lit surface above. His dive light cut through, the gloom illuminating a narrow cone of visibility ahead. The weight of the ocean pressed in around him, a constant reminder of the inherent danger of his chosen profession. Yet Gunnar felt a familiar sense of calm settling over him as he sank deeper. This was his element, a realm he had explored countless times over the decades. As he neared the seafloor, Gunnar's trained eyes scanned for the telltale signs of scallop beds. The beam of his light swept across rocky outcroppings and patches of sand, revealing a bustling ecosystem of marine life. Small fish darted away from the intrusion, their scales glinting momentarily in the artificial light. A school of herring passed overhead, their silver bodies moving in perfect unison. Gunnar paused his descent to watch them, marveling at the choreographed dance of survival that played out before him. In that moment, he felt infinitely small, a mere visitor in this vast underwater kingdom. The sound of his own breathing, amplified by the regulator, filled Gunnar's ears. It was a rhythmic, almost meditative sound that helped him maintain his focus. He checked his dive computer, noting his depth and the steadily decreasing temperature. Everything was proceeding as expected. As Gunnar's fins finally touched the seafloor, a small cloud of silt billowed up around him. He adjusted his buoyancy, hovering just above the bottom to avoid stirring up more sediment. The beam of his light caught the distinctive shape of a scallop shell half buried in the sand. With practiced movements, Gunnar began his harvest. He worked methodically, selecting only the mature specimens and leaving the younger scallops to grow. His mesh bag slowly filled, the shells clinking softly against each other with each addition. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the underwater silence. Gunnar fell into a comfortable rhythm, his body moving with the efficiency born of years of experience. Yet even as he focused on his task, a part of him remained alert, attuned to the subtle changes in his environment. It was during a momentary pause to check his air supply that Gunnar first sensed something was amiss. There was a stillness, too, the water that felt unnatural, as if the very currents were holding their breath. The small fish that had been darting about earlier were nowhere to be seen. Gunnar straightened, sweeping his light in a wide arc around him. The beam caught nothing but empty water and swirling particles, yet the feeling of unease persisted, prickling at the back of his neck. "Just nerves," Gunnar muttered to himself, his voice distorted by the regulator. "Getting jumpy in your old age, aren't you?" He tried to shake off the feeling, returning his attention to the scallop bed before him, but his movements were more hurried now, less precise. The weight of the water above him suddenly felt oppressive, and Gunnar found himself glancing over his shoulder more frequently. It was as he reached for a particularly large scallop that he felt it. A vibration in the water so low and deep that he felt it more than heard it. Gunnar froze, his hand hovering above the shell. Every instinct honed by years in the sea suddenly screamed danger. Slowly, deliberately, Gunnar turned, his light probing the darkness behind him. For a moment, he saw nothing. Then, just at the edge of his light's reach, something moved. It was massive, a shape blacker than the surrounding water. There and gone so quickly, Gunnar almost convinced himself he had imagined it. Heart pounding, Gunnar began to rise from the seafloor. His movements were slow and controlled, careful not to make any sudden motions that might attract attention. The collection bag hung heavy at his side, but Gunnar barely noticed its weight. Every sense was on high alert, straining to detect any sign of threat in the oppressive darkness. As he ascended, Gunnar's eyes darted constantly between his surroundings and his dive computer. He was about halfway to the surface when he heard it, a haunting, melodic call that seemed to reverberate through the water. It was a sound Gunnar had heard before, but never this close, never with such clarity. Orca. The realization hit Gunnar like a physical blow. Orcas were not uncommon in these waters, but they generally stayed far offshore. To encounter one in the cove, especially at night, was virtually unheard of. Gunnar's ascent became more urgent, his powerful legs kicking with renewed strength. The surface seemed impossibly far away, a faint shimmer of aurora-lit water that refused to draw closer. The orca's call came again, closer this time. Gunnar thought he could detect a note of curiosity in the haunting sound. Or was it hunger? "Stay. Calm," Gunnar coached himself, forcing his breathing to remain steady. "Panic is a diver's worst enemy. Just keep moving, slow and steady." But even as he spoke the words, Gunnar felt the first tendrils of real fear curling in his gut. Orcas were intelligent, curious creatures, but they were also apex predators. And right now Gunnar was acutely aware of how vulnerable he was. The water around him began to lighten as he neared the surface. Gunnar could see the shimmering curtain of the aurora above, its ethereal light dancing on the waves. Just a few more meters, and he would break through into the air, into safety. A shadow passed overhead, momentarily blocking out the light from above. Gunnar's heart leapt into his throat. He looked up, expecting to see the sleek black and white form of the orca above him. Instead, he saw nothing but open water. The relief was short-lived. As Gunnar turned his head, movement caught his eye. There, just meters away, was the orca. It was massive, far larger than Gunnar had anticipated. Its black skin seemed to absorb the light from his dive lamp, creating a void in the water. Time seemed to stand still as Gunnar met the orca's eye. There was an intelligence there, a curiosity that seemed almost human. For a moment, Gunnar forgot his fear, lost in the wonder of this close encounter with one of the ocean's most magnificent creatures. Then the orca moved, and the spell was broken. It circled Gunnar slowly, its powerful tail propelling it through the water with effortless grace. Gunnar turned with it, never letting the creature out of his sight. His hand inched towards the dive knife strapped to his leg, though he knew it would be of little use against such a formidable opponent. "Easy now," Gunnar murmured, his voice barely audible over the sound of his own rapid breathing. "I'm not here to hurt you. Just passing through, that's all." The orca showed no reaction to his words, continuing its leisurely circuit around the diver. Gunnar's mind raced, trying to recall everything he knew about orca behavior. They were not typically aggressive towards humans, but there had been rare instances of attacks. Was this orca merely curious, or was it sizing him up as potential prey? Gunnar's dive computer beeped, warning him that he was ascending too quickly. He forced himself to slow his ascent, despite every instinct screaming at him to rush for the surface. A rapid ascent could lead to decompression sickness, the bends, which could be just as deadly as any predator. The Orca suddenly darted forward, passing so close to Gunnar that he felt the rush of water from its movement. He flinched, nearly losing his regulator in the process. When he looked again, the Orca had disappeared into the gloom. Gunnar spun in the water, his light probing the darkness in all directions. The Orca was gone, vanished as quickly and silently as it had appeared. But Gunnar knew better than to assume. He was safe. He resumed his ascent, every muscle tense, ready to react to the slightest hint of movement. The surface was tantalizingly close now. Gunnar could see the bottom of his boat, a dark shape against the shimmering aurora above. Just a few more meters, and he would be out of the water. He allowed himself a glimmer of hope. Perhaps the Orca had lost interest, moved on to easier prey. It was then that Gunnar heard it. A rush of water behind him, the sound of something. Large, moving at high speed. He turned, bringing his light to bear, but it was already too late. The Orca hit him with the force of a freight train. Gunnar felt a searing pain in his leg as the creature's powerful jaws clamped down. The world spun around him as the Orca shook its head, treating Gunnar like a rag doll. His mask was torn away, and suddenly his lungs were filling with seawater. In that moment of pure terror and pain, a strange calm descended over Gunnar. Time seemed to slow, and he found himself noticing the most minute details. The play of light on the Orca's skin, the perfect hydrodynamic shape of its body. Part of him, the part that had always been in awe of the sea and its creatures, marveled at the raw power and beauty of the animal even as it attacked him. Then, as suddenly as it had struck, the Orca released him. Gunnar found himself spinning in the water, disoriented and in shock. His leg throbbed with a pain so intense it threatened to overwhelm him. Through the haze of agony and confusion, one thought burned bright in Gunnar's mind: survive. With strength, born of desperation, Gunnar kicked for the surface. Each movement sent waves of agony through his injured leg, but he pushed through the pain. The Orca's haunting call echoed through the water once more, closer now. Gunnar knew it was coming, back to finish what it had started. The surface was just meters away when Gunnar felt it, the rush of water that signaled the Orca's return. He closed his eyes, bracing for the impact, but it never came. Instead, Gunnar broke through into the air, gasping and spluttering. The shock of the cold night air hit him like a slap. Gunnar's lungs burned as he gulped in great breaths, his body trembling with adrenaline and pain. He could see his boat bobbing gently just meters away. It might as well have been miles. A dark fin broke the surface nearby, circling. The Orca hadn't given up. It was toying with him now, like a cat with a mouse. Gunnar knew he had only moments before it struck again. With the last reserves of his strength, Gunnar began to swim towards the boat. Each stroke was agony, his injured leg trailing uselessly behind him. The Orca's fin dipped beneath the surface, disappearing from view. Gunnar's heart pounded in his ears as he waited for the final attack. His hand touched the side of the boat just as he felt the water surge behind him. Gunnar pulled himself up with desperate strength, tumbling over the gunwale and onto the deck. He lay there, gasping and shaking, as the Orca's massive form glided silently past the boat. As the adrenaline began to fade, the full extent of Gunnar's injuries made themselves known. His leg was a mess of torn wetsuit and flesh, blood pooling on the deck beneath him. The cold night air bit into his wet skin, and shock was setting in fast. With trembling hands, Gunnar reached for the emergency beacon on his belt. He pressed the button, sending out a silent call for help. As he lay on the deck, the aurora dancing overhead, and the Orca's fin still visible in the water nearby, Gunnar's thoughts turned to Inga. "I'm sorry, Elsken," he whispered into the night. "You were right to worry." The Orca's haunting call echoed across the water one last time, before it disappeared into the depths, leaving Gunnar alone with the night and his pain, waiting for rescue under the shimmering curtain of the northern lights. The Orca glided through the dark waters of the cove, its massive form moving with a grace that belied its size. It had strayed far from its usual hunting grounds, drawn by some instinct it didn't fully understand. The pod was far behind, their familiar calls lost to the vast silence of the open ocean. But the Orca was not concerned. It was the apex predator of these waters, fear unknown to its kind. As it entered the sheltered cove, The orca's highly tuned senses picked up an unfamiliar presence. Something was disturbing the natural rhythm of the underwater world. Fish scattered in unusual patterns, their movements erratic and panicked. The orca's curiosity was piqued. It circled the perimeter of the cove, its echolocation painting a detailed picture of the underwater landscape. Rocky outcroppings, patches of seaweed, schools of fish, all normal features of its environment. But there was something else, something that didn't belong. The orca dove deeper, its powerful tail propelling it through the water with effortless speed. As it neared the bottom of the cove, a faint light caught its attention. Artificial light had no place in these depths. The orca's natural curiosity overcame its usual caution, and it moved closer to investigate. That's when it saw him, a strange, shiny creature moving along the seafloor. The orca had encountered divers before, but rarely in such isolated locations, and never at night. This one seemed different somehow. Its covering sparkled and flashed, in the low light, reminiscent of the scales of a large fish. The orca circled at a distance, observing. The diver seemed oblivious to its presence, focused on some task at the bottom of the cove. Small creatures were being collected and placed. In a mesh container, the orca recognized them as food. It had eaten similar shellfish before, crushing their hard exteriors with its powerful jaws to reach the soft flesh inside. As it watched, a primal urge began to stir within the orca. The diver's movements, the flashing of its suit, the vibrations it sent through the water, all triggered the orca's predatory instincts. In its mind, the line between diver and prey began to blur. The orca let out a low call, more felt than heard through the dense water. It was a sound that usually sent smaller marine life scattering in terror. But the diver's reaction was delayed, almost hesitant. This confused the orca. Prey should flee, should thrash and struggle. This creature's behavior was all wrong. Intrigued and increasingly agitated, the orca moved closer. It could sense the diver's heart rate increasing, could taste the faint traces of fear beginning to seep into the water. Yes, this was more like it. This was how prey should react. The orca circled again, tightening its loop around the diver. It watched as the strange creature began to ascend, moving towards the surface with increasing urgency. The chase was on, in. The orca's mind, memories of countless hunts surfaced. The exhilaration of the pursuit, the satisfying crunch as its jaws closed around its prey, the taste of fresh meat. All these sensations flooded its consciousness. But there was something else too, a nagging doubt that it couldn't quite shake. This prey was different. It moved wrong, smelled wrong. Part of the orca recognized that this was not its usual food, but the thrill of the hunt had taken hold now. Pushing such doubts to the background, the orca surged upward, easily keeping pace with the ascending diver. It could have overtaken its prey at any moment, but that wasn't the orca's way. The hunt was as much about the chase as the kill. It wanted to play with its food first, to feel the fear and desperation emanating from its victim. As they neared the surface, the orca grew bolder. It darted in close, brushing against the diver's legs before veering away. It could taste the spike of terror this elicited, and it only fueled the orca's excitement. The surface was close now. The orca knew from experience that this was where its prey often tried to escape. Many creatures believed that breaking the boundary between water and air would bring safety. The orca knew better. There was nowhere its prey could go that it couldn't follow. Just as the diver was about to break the surface, the orca made its move. With a powerful thrust of its tail, it launched itself at its target. Its jaws opened wide, rows of sharp teeth, gleaming in the faint light from above. The impact was tremendous. The orca felt its teeth sink into flesh and neoprene, tasted blood in the water. It shook its head violently, an instinctive motion designed to tear and incapacitate its prey. The diver's body went limp for a moment, and the orca felt a surge of triumph. But then something unexpected happened. The diver began to struggle again with a strength the orca hadn't anticipated. It wasn't the frantic thrashing of a dying animal, but purposeful movements aimed at escape. Surprised, the orca released its grip. This wasn't how its hunts usually went. Prey that had felt its bite didn't usually have the will or the ability to keep fighting. The Orca backed off slightly, reassessing the situation. The diver was at the surface now, clinging to a floating object. A boat, the Orca realized. It had seen such things before, usually accompanied by the loud, irritating noises of engines and the sharp sting of propellers. But this one was silent and still. The Orca circled the boat, its dorsal fin cutting through the surface of the water. It could smell the blood in the water, could sense the diver's rapid heartbeat, and labored, breathing. The hunt wasn't over yet. As it circled, the Orca's echolocation picked up new vibrations in the water. Something was approaching from a distance. More boats, larger ones. The Orca recognized the sound of their engines, the disturbance they created. In the water. A new set of instincts kicked in. Years of experience had taught the Orca that these larger boats often meant danger. They brought nets and harpoons and other threats that even an apex predator knew to avoid. The Orca made one last pass by the small boat. Its prey was still there, still alive. The urge to finish the hunt warred with the Orca's survival instincts. In the end, caution won out. With a powerful flick of its tail, the Orca dove deep, leaving the injured diver and the approaching boats behind. As it swam away from the cove, back towards the open ocean and its waiting pod, the Orca felt a mix of emotions. There was frustration at the interrupted hunt, confusion over the strange prey it had encountered, and a lingering excitement from the chase. But mostly there was a simple acceptance. The ocean was vast and full of mysteries. This had been just another hunt, albeit an unusual one. There would be others. The Orca picked up speed as it left the coastal waters behind. Its powerful body cut through the water with ease, every movement a testament to millions of years of evolution. The encounter with the diver was already fading from its mind, replaced by more immediate concerns, rejoining the pod, finding the next meal, continuing the endless journey through the world's oceans. As the Orca swam, its haunting call echoed through the water one last time. It was a sound that carried for miles, a reminder to all who heard it of the power and mystery of the ocean's greatest predator. And then, like a ghost, the Orca disappeared into the depths, leaving no trace of its passing save for the memory of its encounter, etched into the mind of one terrified diver. Miles away, in the warmth and safety of the Coast Guard station, a young officer named Eric Larson stifled a yawn as he gazed at the radar screen. It had been a quiet night, the kind that made the long hours of a graveyard shift seem endless. The steady beep of the equipment and the low hum of computers were the only sounds breaking the silence. Eric's eyes flicked to the clock on the wall, just past 2 a.m. Still 4 hours to go before his shift ended. He reached for his coffee mug, grimacing as he took a sip of the cold, bitter liquid. "Anything exciting out there, Larson?" The voice of his supervisor, Captain Maya Nordstrom, made Eric straighten in his chair. "All quiet, Captain," Eric replied, trying to inject some enthusiasm into his voice. "Just a few fishing boats out near." He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes narrowing as he focused on a blinking light on his screen. "Wait a second." Captain Nordstrom moved closer, her own fatigue forgotten as she sensed the change in Eric's demeanor. "What is it?" Eric's fingers flew over the keyboard, zooming in on the signal. "We've got an emergency beacon activated, ma'am, coming from Husavik Cove." The captain's brow furrowed. "Husavik? That's odd. Not many go out there this time of night." She leaned in, studying the screen. "Any vessel registration associated with the beacon?" Eric shook his head. "No, ma'am, it's a personal beacon. Diver's emergency signal." Captain Nordstrom straightened, her face set in grim determination. "Alert the rescue team. I want a boat. In the water in 10 minutes. And get me everything we have on conditions in that area." As Eric rushed to carry out her orders, the captain's mind raced through possible scenarios. A diver in trouble at this hour, in such a remote location. It didn't bode well. She'd seen too many tragedies in her years with the Coast Guard to be optimistic. Within minutes, the quiet station had transformed into a hive of activity. Rescue team members donned survival suits, medics checked and double-checked their equipment. The low rumble of engines signaled the launch boat being prepared. Captain Nordstrom stood at the center of it all, coordinating the efforts with practiced efficiency. "Jensen, I want constant communication with the rescue boat. Larson, keep an eye on that beacon. If it moves or goes offline, I want to know immediately." As the rescue boat sped out into the night, its powerful searchlights cutting through the darkness. The captain allowed herself a moment of quiet concern. "Whoever you are out there," she murmured, "hold on. Help is on the way." Back in the cove, Gunnar clung to consciousness with grim determination. The cold was seeping into his bones, his injured leg a throbbing mass of pain. He had managed to pull himself fully into the boat, but the effort had nearly caused him to black out. "Stay awake," he muttered through chattering teeth. "Stay awake, you old fool." He knew the dangers of hypothermia, knew that sleep could be fatal in his condition. But the pull of unconsciousness was strong, a siren song promising relief from the pain and cold. Gunnar's thoughts turned to Inga, to the worry in her eyes as he had set out. He imagined her sleeping peacefully at home, unaware of the danger he was in. The image brought a mix of comfort and regret. "I'm sorry, Elsken," he whispered into the night. "You were right to worry." A sound caught his attention, a low, haunting call that seemed to vibrate through the hull of the boat. Gunnar's blood ran cold. The Orca was still out there, circling, waiting. He forced himself to sit up, ignoring the screaming protest from his injured leg. His eyes scanned the dark water, searching for any sign of the massive predator. There, a flash of white, the curve of a dorsal fin breaking the surface. Gunnar's hand inched towards the emergency flare gun stored in the boat's safety kit. If the Orca attacked again, it was his only defense. But even as his fingers closed around the cold metal, he hesitated. Despite everything, Gunnar couldn't bring himself to harm the creature. It was just following its instincts, doing what millions of years of evolution had designed it to do. The true folly lay in his own actions, in his arrogance at thinking he could safely invade this wild realm. The Orca surfaced again, closer this time. Gunnar could see its eye, intelligent and curious, watching him. For a moment, predator and prey regarded each other across the gulf of species. Then, with a flick of its powerful tail, the Orca dove deep and disappeared. Gunnar let out a breath. He hadn't realized he'd been holding. Whether by luck or some unfathomable decision on the part of the Orca, he had been spared. Now, if his beacon had been received, if help was on the way, he might just survive this night. As if in answer to his thoughts, Gunnar heard a new sound, the distant rumble of engines. He looked up, his heart leaping as he saw the faint glow of lights on the horizon. Rescue was coming. With the last of his strength, Gunnar reached for the emergency flare gun. His hands shook as he pointed it skyward and pulled the trigger. The bright red flare arced into the night sky, casting an eerie glow over the cove. As the rescue boat drew nearer, its searchlight sweeping the water, Gunnar allowed himself to relax slightly. He had survived the hunt, had faced one of nature's greatest predators, and lived to tell the tale. But as the adrenaline faded, and the full weight of his experience settled over him, Gunnar knew that this night would stay with him forever. The Orca's haunting call echoed across the water one last time, a farewell and a reminder of the wild, untamable nature of the sea. Then it was gone, disappearing into the depths, leaving Gunnar alone with the night and his pain, waiting for rescue under the shimmering curtain of the northern lights. Gunnar's heart pounded in his chest as he broke the surface, gasping for air. The frigid Icelandic water felt like needles against his exposed skin, where the Orca's teeth had torn his wetsuit. He frantically scanned the dark waves around him, expecting the massive predator to emerge at any moment and finish what it had started. The small boat bobbed tantalizingly close, just a few meters away. It might as well have been miles. Gunnar's injured leg trailed uselessly behind him, a bright streak of red billowing in the water. He knew he was leaving a trail that would lead the Orca right to him. "Move, you old fool," Gunnar muttered through chattering teeth. "Move or die." With a grimace of pain, he began to swim towards the boat. Each stroke sent waves of agony through his body, but the alternative, remaining in the water as easy prey, was unthinkable. The ethereal glow of the aurora borealis danced overhead, casting another worldly light on the scene. In any other circumstance, Gunnar would have paused to marvel at its beauty. Now it served only to illuminate his desperate struggle for survival. Dark fin broke the surface nearby, circling. The Orca hadn't given up. It was toying with him now like a cat with a mouse. Gunnar knew he had only moments before it struck again. "Please," he gasped, though he wasn't sure who or what he was pleading. "Tire, please, just let me reach the boat." His fingers brushed against the hull, slick with algae and sea spray. Gunnar clawed at it, trying to find purchase. The Orca's fin disappeared beneath the waves, and he felt a surge of water behind him. With a last desperate heave, Gunnar pulled himself over the gunwale, tumbling onto the deck just as the Orca's massive form glided silently past the boat. For several long moments, Gunnar lay there, gasping and shaking. The cold night air bit into his wet skin, and shock was setting in fast. But he was alive. Somehow, against all odds, he had survived. As the adrenaline began to fade, the full extent of Gunnar's injuries made themselves known. His leg was a mess of torn flesh and neoprene, blood pooling on the deck beneath him. He needed to stop the bleeding, and fast. With trembling hands, Gunnar reached for the emergency kit stowed under the seat. His fingers, numb with cold, fumbled with the latches. "Come on," he growled, frustration mounting. Finally, the box popped open, revealing its life-saving contents. Gunnar grabbed a pressure bandage and, gritting his teeth against the pain, began to wrap his mangled leg. Each touch sent jolts of agony through him, but he forced himself to continue. The alternative was bleeding out on the deck of his own boat. As he worked, Gunnar's mind raced. How had this happened? He'd been diving these waters for decades, had encountered orcas before without incident. What had made this one attack? Was it a rogue, separated from its pod? Or had Gunnar simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, a victim of nature's indifference? A haunting call echoed across the water, sending chills down Gunnar's spine that had nothing to do with the cold. The orca was still out there, circling, waiting. "What do you want from me?" Gunnar shouted into the darkness, a mix of fear and anger in his voice. "You've had your fun, now leave me be." As if in response, the orca's massive form breached the surface, crashing back down with a spectacular splash. Gunnar flinched, half expecting the impact to capsize his small boat. But the vessel held steady, bobbing in the suddenly choppy waters. Gunnar's hand inched towards the flare gun stored in the emergency kit. It was meant to signal for help, but in this moment, it was the only weapon he had. If the orca decided to attack the boat, but even as his fingers closed around the cold metal, Gunnar hesitated. Despite everything, he couldn't bring himself to harm the creature. It was just following its instincts, doing what millions of years of evolution had designed it to do. The true folly lay in his own actions, in his arrogance at thinking he could safely invade this wild realm. The orca surfaced again, closer this time. Gunnar could see its eye, intelligent and curious, watching him. For a moment, predator and prey regarded each other across the gulf of species. Then, with a flick of its powerful tail, the orca dove deep and disappeared. Gunnar let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Whether by luck or some unfathomable decision on the part of the orca, he had been spared. Now, if his emergency beacon had been received, if help was on the way, he might just survive this night. With shaking hands, Gunnar reached for the radio. He needed to call for help, to let someone know where he was. But as he lifted the handset to his lips, a horrible realization dawned on him. In the chaos of the attack and his desperate scramble into the boat, the radio had been knocked from its mount. It lay in pieces on the deck, victim to his frantic struggle for survival. "No, no, no," Gunnar muttered, despair threatening to overwhelm him. The emergency beacon was his only hope now. He had activated it during the attack, but there was no way to know if the signal had been received. The night seemed to press in around him, the vast emptiness of the sea suddenly oppressive. Gunnar had never felt so alone, so small in the face of nature's immensity. The aurora continued its silent dance overhead, indifferent to the drama playing out below. As the adrenaline faded, exhaustion and cold began to take hold. Gunnar knew the dangers of hypothermia, knew that he needed to get warm and dry, but moving seemed an impossible task. His body felt leaden, his injured leg a throbbing mass of pain. "Come on, old man," he growled to himself. "You didn't survive an orca attack just to die of cold." With monumental effort, Gunnar dragged himself towards the small cabin at the bow of the boat. Every movement was agony, but he forced himself to continue. Inside, he found a blanket and managed to wrap it around his shivering form. As he huddled in the meager shelter, Gunnar's thoughts turned to Inga. Would he ever see her again? The image of her face lined with worry as he had set out on this ill-fated expedition filled him with regret. "I'm sorry, Elsken," he whispered into the darkness. "You were right to worry. I should have listened." The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Gunnar drifted in and out of consciousness, each time jolting awake with the fear that the Orca had returned. But the sea remained quiet. The only sounds the gentle lapping of waves against the hull and the occasional cry of a seabird. As dawn began to break, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, Gunnar heard a new sound, the distant thrum of an engine. At first he thought it was a hallucination, a product of his pain-addled mind. But as the sound grew louder, hope began to bloom in his chest. With the last reserves of his strength, Gunnar pulled himself out of the cabin and onto the deck. There on the horizon he saw it, a Coast Guard vessel, its orange hull bright against the pale morning sky. "Here," Gunnar shouted, his voice hoarse and weak. "I'm here." He reached for the flare gun, his numb fingers fumbling with the trigger. The bright red flare arced into the sky, a beacon of hope in the vast expanse of sea and sky. As the rescue boat drew nearer, Gunnar allowed himself to relax slightly. He had survived the night, had faced one of nature's greatest predators and lived to tell the tale. But as relief washed over him, so too did the full weight of his experience. The Coast Guard vessel pulled alongside Gunnar's small boat, and he saw faces peering down at him, their expressions a mix of concern and relief. "Quite a night you've had, old-timer," one of the rescuers called down as they prepared to transfer Gunnar to their boat. Gunnar managed a weak smile. "You could say that," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. As gentle hands lifted him from his blood-stained deck, Gunnar caught a flash of movement in the water. There, just for a moment, he saw a sleek black dorsal fin cutting through the waves. The Orca had returned as if to witness the conclusion of their encounter. "Thank you," Gunnar murmured, though whether to the Coast Guard or to the Orca he wasn't sure. As the rescue boat began its journey back to shore, Gunnar closed his eyes, exhaustion finally overtaking him. The last thing he heard before slipping into unconsciousness was the haunting call of the Orca echoing across the water. It was a sound he knew would stay with him for the rest of his days, a reminder of the night he had danced with death beneath the aurora's glow. Miles away, in the warmth and safety of their home, Inga Magnusson paced the kitchen floor. She had barely slept, worry gnawing at her since Gunnar had set out the previous evening. It wasn't like him to stay out all night without checking in. The phone's sudden ring shattered the tense silence. Inga lunged for it, her heart in her throat. "Mrs. Magnusson," a formal voice asked. "This is Captain Nordstrom from the Coast Guard. We've found your husband." Inga's knees went weak, and she gripped the counter for support. "Is he—" "He's alive," the captain assured her quickly. "But he's been injured. We're bringing him to Husavik Hospital now." As Inga rushed to grab her coat and keys, her mind reeled. What could have happened? Gunnar was so experienced, so careful, but she had always feared this day might come. The sea gave, but it also took away. That was the bargain every fisher's wife made. The drive to the hospital was a blur. Inga found herself in the emergency ward, being led to a curtained-off bed where Gunnar lay, pale but alive. "Oh, Gunnar," she breathed, taking in the bandages, the IV lines, the haunted look in his eyes. Gunnar's face softened as he saw her. "Inga." "Elsken, I'm sorry, I should have listened to you." Inga took his hand, feeling its familiar calluses. "Shh, none of that now, you're safe. That's all that matters." A doctor approached, clipboard in hand. "Mrs. Magnusson, I'm Dr. Jonsson. Your husband is very lucky. The wounds are severe, but with time and physical therapy, he should make a full recovery." Inga nodded, relief washing over her. But as she turned back to Gunnar, she saw something in his eyes that gave her pause. It was a look she had never seen before, a mix of awe, fear, and something else she couldn't quite name. "Gunnar," she asked softly, "what happened out there?" Gunnar was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I saw the face of nature, Inga, its beauty and its terror. I don't think I'll ever be the same." As Inga held his hand, offering silent comfort, she knew that whatever had happened on that fateful night would be with them for a long time to come. The sea had spared Gunnar this time, but it had left its mark on him as surely as the scars that would soon heal on his body. Outside the hospital window, the sun rose over the harbor, its light glinting off the waves. Somewhere out there, beneath the surface, life went on as it had for millions of years. The Orca, that magnificent and terrifying creature, continued its eternal journey through the world's oceans, unaware of the profound impact it had left on one man's life. And Gunnar, safe in the hospital bed with Inga by his side, knew that while his body would heal, his soul had been forever changed by his dance with death beneath the aurora's glow. The Coast Guard vessel cut through the choppy waters, its powerful engines propelling it towards the coordinates of the distress signal. Captain Maja Nordstrom stood at the helm, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the first hints of dawn were beginning to break. Her face was a mask of concentration, hiding the worry that gnawed at her gut. "Any update on the beacon, Jensen?" She called over her shoulder to the young officer manning the communications equipment. Jensen shook his head, his brow furrowed. "No change, Captain. Signals still active, but no response to our hails." Maja nodded grimly. A static beacon and radio silence rarely boded well. She'd seen too many rescue missions turn into recovery operations over her years with the coast. "God, keep trying," she ordered, "and tell the medical team to be ready for anything." As the boat sped on, Maya's mind raced through possible scenarios. A diver in trouble at this hour in such a remote location? It didn't make sense. Husavik Cove was known for its rich marine life, but night dives were strictly regulated due to the unpredictable currents and wildlife activity. "Captain," the shout from the lookout snapped Maja out of her thoughts. "I see something. 2 o'clock, about 500 meters out." Maja grabbed her binoculars, focusing on the area indicated. There, bobbing gently in the waves, was a small fishing boat. As they drew closer, she could make out a figure slumped on the deck. "Full stop," Maja barked. "Prepare to board." The rescue team sprang into action with practiced efficiency. As they pulled alongside the fishing boat, Maja got her first clear. Look at the scene. Her breath caught in her throat. The deck was smeared with blood, far more than she'd expected. The figure she'd seen was an older man, wrapped in a blanket and barely conscious. But it was the state of his leg that made Maya's stomach turn. Even through the hastily applied bandages, she could see the telltale signs of a massive bite wound. "What, in God's name, happened here?" she muttered. As the medical team carefully transferred the injured man to their vessel, Maja surveyed the small boat. The radio lay in pieces, and there were deep scratches along the hull, damage inconsistent with normal fishing accidents. "Captain," one of her team called, holding up a torn wetsuit. "Look at this." Maja examined the neoprene, her frown deepening. The tears were massive, spaced in a pattern that sent a chill down her spine. She'd seen wounds like this before, but never on a human victim. "Orca," she said quietly, realization dawning. It was an Orca attack. The implications of this were staggering. Orca attacks on humans were virtually unheard of, especially in these waters. If one had turned aggressive, it could have serious repercussions for the local fishing industry, not to mention the ecosystem. "Jensen," Maja called, "get me a line to headquarters and contact the marine biology department at the university. We're going to need experts on this." As they began the journey back to shore, Maja approached the injured man. The medical team had stabilized him, and he was drifting in and out of consciousness. "Sir," she said gently, "can you tell me your name?" The man's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then locking onto Maya's face. "Gunnar," he rasped. "Gunnar Magnusson." "Mr. Magnusson, I'm Captain Nordstrom with the Coast Guard. Can you tell me what happened?" Gunnar's face contorted, a mix of pain and something else. Fear, perhaps, or awe. "The Orca," he whispered. "It came out of nowhere. So beautiful, so terrible." Maja leaned in closer, her voice soft but urgent. "Mr. Magnusson, this is very important. Was this an unprovoked attack? Did you do anything that might have agitated?" "The Orca?" Gunnar shook his head weakly. "No, I was diving for scallops. It just appeared, circling. I thought it was just curious. Then it attacked." Maja nodded, her mind already racing with the implications. An unprovoked Orca attack was unprecedented in these waters. It would need to be thoroughly investigated. "Thank you, Mr. Magnusson. You're safe now. We'll be at the hospital soon." As Maja turned away, Gunnar's hand shot out, grabbing her arm, with surprising strength. "Captain," he said, his eyes suddenly clear and intense, "it's still out there, and it was hunting." A chill ran down Maya's spine at his words. She patted Gunnar's hand reassuringly, but her mind was already formulating plans. They would need to issue warnings, perhaps even consider closing some of the coastal waters until they could assess the situation. Back at the Coast Guard headquarters, chaos reigned. News of the attack had spread quickly, and Maya found herself at the center of a storm of activity. Government officials, marine biologists, and local fishermen's representatives all demanded answers she didn't have. Captain Nordstrom, a harried-looking aide, called out as Maya strode through the bustling command center. "The Minister of Fisheries is on line 1. He's demanding a full report." Maya suppressed a groan. Politicians always wanted simple answers to complex problems. "Tell him I'll call back within the hour. I need to brief my team first." She gathered her top officers in the conference room, along with Dr. Elena Peterson, the marine biologist who had arrived from the university. The atmosphere was tense as Maya laid out what they knew. At approximately 0200 hours, we received a distress signal from a personal emergency beacon, Maya began. "We located the source in Husavik Cove and found a lone diver, Gunnar Magnusson, who had been attacked by what we believed to be an orca." Murmurs of disbelief rippled through the room. Dr. Peterson leaned forward, her brow furrowed. "Captain, are you certain it was an orca? The injuries could be consistent with a shark attack, which would be far more likely." Maya shook her head. "Mr. Magnusson was clear about what he saw, and the bite pattern. Elena, you need to see it for yourself. This was no shark, the marine." Biologists' frown deepened. "If you're right, this is unprecedented. Orcas simply don't attack humans unprovoked. There must be some explanation." "That's what we need to find out," Maya said firmly. "Elena, I need you and your team to analyze every piece of data we have. Water samples, the damage to Magnusson's boat, everything. If there's an environmental factor causing this behavior, we need to know." She turned to her officers. "I want increased patrols along the coast, especially near popular diving and fishing spots. No one goes in the water until we know what we're dealing with. And get me everything we have on orcapods in the area. Known migrations, recent sightings, anything that might give us a clue." As the team dispersed to their tasks, Maya felt the weight of responsibility settling heavily on her shoulders. She had to balance public safety with the need to avoid panic. One attack, however serious, didn't necessarily indicate a larger pattern. But if there was an aggressive orca out there, her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Jensen entered, his face pale. "Captain, we've just received word from the hospital. Mr. Magnusson is awake and asking to speak with you. He says he has something important to tell you about the orca." Maya was on her feet immediately. "Tell them I'm on my way, and Jensen, not a word of this to anyone, understood? The last thing we need is rumors spreading before we have all the facts." The drive to the hospital was tense, Maya's mind whirling with possibilities. What could Gunnar have remembered that was so important? And would it help them unravel the mystery of this unprecedented attack? At the hospital, Maya found Gunnar propped up in bed, his wife Inga holding his hand. The old diver looked pale but alert, his eyes lighting up as Maya entered the room. "Captain," he said, his voice stronger than it had been on the boat. "Thank you for coming." Maya pulled up a chair, her notepad ready. "Mr. Magnusson, I understand you have some information about the orca that attacked you." Gunnar nodded, his expression grave. "I've been diving these waters for over 40 years, Captain. I've seen orcas before, but never like this. This one, it was different." "Different? How?" Maya pressed gently. Gunnar's eyes took on a distant look, as if he was reliving the encounter. It was alone, for one thing. Orcas usually travel in pods, and its behavior, it wasn't just hunting, Captain. It was playing. Maya frowned. "Playing?" "Yes," Gunnar said, a shudder running through him. "It could have killed me at any time, but it kept circling, attacking and then backing off, like it was studying. Testing me." Inga squeezed her husband's hand, concern etched on her face. Maya leaned forward, her voice low and urgent. "Mr. Magnuson, this is very important. Did you notice anything unusual about the Orca's appearance? Any distinctive markings or injuries?" Gunnar was quiet for a moment, his brow furrowed in concentration. Then his eyes widened. "Yes," he said slowly. "Now that you mention it, there was something. A scar, I think. Along its left side, just behind the dorsal fin, like it had been caught in a net or something." Maya's heart raced. This could be the break they needed, a way to identify the specific Orca involved. She made a note, already planning, to cross-reference it with known pods in the area. "Thank you, Mr. Magnuson," she said, standing. "This information could be crucial. I promise you, we're doing everything we can to understand what happened and prevent it from happening again." As she turned to leave, Gunnar called out once more, "Captain, please be careful out there. What I saw in that creature's eyes, it wasn't just an animal acting on instinct. There was intelligence there, and something else. Something I can't explain." Maya nodded solemnly, a chill running down her spine despite the warmth of the hospital room. As she left, she could feel the weight of Gunnar's words settling over her like a shroud. Outside, Maya paused to collect her thoughts. The situation was more complex than she had initially realized. An intelligent, possibly injured Orca exhibiting unprecedented behavior. It was a recipe for disaster if not handled carefully. She pulled out her phone, dialing Dr. Peterson. "Helena, it's Maya. We need to expand our search parameters. I'm looking for records of any orcas in the area with a distinctive scar behind the left dorsal fin, and I need everything you can give me on solo orcas, ones separated from their pods. This might be more than just a random attack." As she hung up, Maya gazed out over the harbor. Somewhere out there, beneath the seemingly peaceful waves, a predator unlike any they had encountered before was lurking, and it was her job to find it before anyone else got hurt. The sun was rising higher now, its rays glinting off the water. To the casual observer, it was a beautiful, ordinary day. But Maya knew better. The calm surface hid depths of mystery and danger, and she had a sinking feeling that the attack on Gunnar Magnusson was just the beginning of something much larger and more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. With a deep breath, Maya squared her shoulders and headed back to her vehicle. There was work to be done, a mystery to unravel, and above all, people to protect. The hunt for the rogue Orca had begun. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital corridor seemed to buzz in sync with the tension headache building behind Gunnar's eyes. He sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, his injured leg propped up on another, waiting for the doctor to return with his test results. The events of the past 24 hours played on an endless loop in his mind, each replay bringing a fresh wave of disbelief and lingering terror. Inga sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm. She hadn't left his side since he'd been brought in, her presence a constant anchor in the storm of his thoughts. Gunnar could see the worry etched in. The lines of her face, could feel it in the slight tremor of her hand against his skin. "Gunnar," Inga said softly, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. "What happened out there?" "Really?" Gunnar closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. How could he explain it to her? How could he put into words the primal fear, the awe, the strange sense of connection he'd felt in those moments beneath the waves? "I don't know if I can explain it, Elskin," he finally said, his voice rough with exhaustion. It was like nothing I've ever experienced." Inga's grip on his arm tightened slightly. "Try, please, I need to understand." Gunnar nodded, gathering his thoughts. "It started like any other dive. The water was cold but clear. The aurora was beautiful, lighting up the surface above me. I was focused on the scallops, you know how. He paused, a shudder running through him as the memory intensified. "That's when I felt it. A vibration in the water. At first, I thought it was just a large fish passing by. But then I saw it." "The Orca," Inga whispered. Gunnar nodded. "It was massive, so much bigger than you can imagine when you're in the water with it. And its eye... Inga, I've never seen anything like it. There was intelligence there, curiosity. It was studying me as much as I was studying it." He fell silent for a moment, lost in the memory. Inga waited patiently, her thumb tracing soothing circles on his arm. "I wasn't afraid. Not at first," Gunnar continued. "I've seen orcas before, from the boat. They've always seemed playful, almost friendly. But this one, there was something different about it, something hungry. Gunner's free hand clenched into a fist, his knuckles white. It started circling me, closer and closer. I knew I needed to get to the surface, but I was afraid any sudden movement would provoke it. And then he trailed off, his breath coming faster. Inga leaned in, her voice gentle but insistent. "And then what, Gunner?" "It attacked," Gunner said, the words barely above a whisper. One moment it was circling, the next it was coming straight for me. I felt its teeth guarding the pain, Inga's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back, staying strong for her husband. "But you survived. You made it back to the boat." Gunner nodded, his eyes distant. "Somehow. I don't even know how. It was like it was playing with me. It could have killed me at any time, but it kept letting me go, only to attack again. When I finally reached the boat, I thought it was over. But it kept circling, ramming the hull. I was sure it was going to capsize us." He turned to look at Inga, his eyes haunted. "Why did it let me go, Inga? Why didn't it finish me off?" Before Inga could respond, the door opened, and Dr. Jonsson entered, a tablet in hand and a serious expression on his face. Gunnar and Inga straightened, tension radiating from them both. "Mr. Magnusson," the doctor said, pulling up a chair to sit across from them. "We've got your test results back. The good news is that there's no sign of infection in your wound. The antibiotics are doing their job." Gunnar nodded, but he could sense there was more. "And the bad news?" Dr. Jonsson's expression softened slightly. "The damage to your leg is insignificant. The bite has torn through muscle and nicked an artery. We've managed to repair the worst of it, but you're looking at a long recovery period, months of physical therapy at least." The words hit Gunnar like a physical blow. Months of recovery. What would that mean for his livelihood, for his life? Will I be able to dive again?" Gunnar asked, dreading the answer. The doctor hesitated, and in that pause, Gunnar felt his world shift. "It's too early to say for certain," Dr. Jonsson said carefully. "With proper rehabilitation, you may regain full function. But diving, that's a high-risk activity even for someone in peak physical condition. I would strongly advise against it, at least for the foreseeable future." Gunnar felt Inga's hand tighten on his arm, heard her sharp intake of breath, but he felt oddly calm, almost detached. It was as if a part of him had known, from the moment the orca's teeth had closed around his leg, that his life would never be the same. "I understand," Gunnar said, his voice steadier than he felt. "What happens now?" Dr. Jonsson leaned forward, his tone becoming more businesslike. "We'll keep you here for a few more days to monitor the wound and start you on a course of physical therapy. Once you're released, you'll need to continue with outpatient therapy several times a week. It's going to be a long road, Mr. Magnusson, but with hard work and patience you can make a good recovery." Gunnar nodded, trying to process the information. A long road indeed, but at least he was alive to walk it. As the doctor stood to leave, a thought struck Gunnar. "Dr. Jonsson," he called out. "The Orca, has there been any news? Any other sightings or incidents?" The doctor paused at the door, a flicker of something, concern, unease, crossing his face. "I'm not really privy to that kind of information, Mr. Magnusson, but I haven't heard of any other attacks, if that's what you're asking. Try not to worry about it. Focus on your recovery." As the door closed behind the doctor, Gunnar turned to Inga. He could see the mix of relief and worry warring on her face. "It's going to be all right, Elsken," he said, trying to inject confidence into his voice. "We'll get through this." Inga nodded, blinking back tears. "Of course we will. You're alive. That's what matters. Everything else, we'll figure it out." But even as she spoke, Gunnar could see the questions in her eyes, the same questions that haunted him. How would they manage financially during his recovery? Would he ever be able to return to the work he loved? And what about the Orca? Was it still out there, perhaps waiting for its next victim? As if reading his thoughts, Inga squeezed his hand. "Don't think about it now," she said softly. "You need to rest, to heal. We'll take it one day at a time." Gunnar nodded, grateful for her strength, but as he leaned back in the uncomfortable hospital chair, Closing his eyes against the harsh lights, he couldn't shake the memory of the orca's eye. That intelligent, curious gaze that had seemed to look right through him. He had a feeling that this encounter, as traumatic as it had been, was far from over. Outside the hospital window, life in Husavik continued as normal. Fishing boats bobbed. In the harbor, tourists wandered the streets, and the ever-present sea stretched to the horizon. But beneath that calm surface, Gunnar knew something had changed. A predator, unlike any they had encountered before, was lurking in those familiar waters. And he couldn't shake the feeling that their paths would cross again. As exhaustion finally overtook him, Gunnar drifted into an uneasy sleep. In his dreams, he was back in the water, surrounded by the ethereal glow of the aurora. And there, emerging from the darkness, was the orca. But this time, instead of attacking, it seemed to be trying to tell him something. If only he could understand. Inga watched her husband sleep, her heart heavy with worry. She had always known the risks of Gunnar's profession, had lived with the fear of a call in the night telling her he wouldn't be coming home. But this was different. It wasn't just the physical injuries, though those were serious enough. It was the look in Gunnar's eyes, the way he spoke about the orca. Something fundamental had shifted in him, and Inga wasn't sure how to help him navigate this new reality. She stood, stretching muscles stiff from hours of sitting. As she moved to the window, gazing out at the town she had called home all her life, Inga felt a strange sense of foreboding. The attack on Gunnar felt like more than just a random incident. It was as if nature itself had sent them a message, a warning. But of what? A knock at the door startled Inga from her thoughts. She turned to see Captain Nordstrom entering, her face grave. "Mrs. Magnusson," the captain said softly, mindful of Gunnar's sleeping form. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but I need to speak with your husband. It's important." Inga nodded, moving to gently wake Gunnar. As he stirred, blinking in confusion at the captain's presence, Inga couldn't shake the feeling that their ordeal was far from over. Whatever news the captain brought, she sensed it would only be the beginning of a much larger story. A story that, for better or worse, they were now inextricably part of. Captain Maya Nordstrom stood at the entrance to Gunnar's hospital room, her face a mask of professional concern. The weight of the information she carried seemed to press down on her shoulders, making her usually straight posture sag slightly. "Mr. Magnusson," she said softly, nodding to Gunnar as he stirred awake. "I apologize for disturbing your rest, but I'm afraid this can't wait." Gunnar pushed himself up in the bed, wincing slightly as the movement jostled his injured leg. Inga moved to his side, her hand instinctively finding his. "What is it, Captain?" Gunnar asked, his voice rough with sleep, but his eyes alert. Maya glanced at Inga, then back to Gunnar. "Perhaps we should speak privately. Anything you have to say to me, you can say in front of my wife," Gunnar interrupted firmly. Maya nodded, pulling up a chair. "Very well. Mr. Magnusson, we've been investigating the incident that occurred during your dive. I need to ask you some more questions about what you saw." Gunnar's brow furrowed. "I've told you everything I remember, Captain. It was dark. I was focused on the scallops, and then suddenly the orca was there." "I understand," Maya said, leaning forward. "But I need you to think carefully. Did you notice anything unusual about the orca? Any distinctive markings or behavior?" Gunnar closed his eyes, trying to recall the terrifying encounter. I'm not sure, it all happened so fast." "Please, Mr. Magnusson," Maya pressed. "Even the smallest detail could be important." Gunnar was quiet for a long moment, his face tightening with concentration. Suddenly his eyes snapped open. There was something, a scar, I think, along its left side just behind the dorsal fin. Maya's breath caught. "Are you certain?" Gunnar nodded slowly. Yes, I'm sure of it now. It looked like it had been caught in a net or something similar." Maya sat back, her mind racing. This matched the description they had received from other sightings. It was the confirmation she had been both hoping for and dreading. "Mr. Magnusson," she said carefully, "I believe the orca that attacked you is a known individual. We've been tracking reports of an unusually aggressive male, separated from its pod for several months now." Inga gasped softly, her grip on Gunnar's hand tightening. Gunnar leaned forward, ignoring the pain in his leg. "What do you mean, tracking reports? Has it attacked others?" Maya hesitated, weighing her words. "There have been incidents, mostly with boats and fishing equipment. Your encounter is the first direct attack on a human that we know of. But why?" Inga asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why is it behaving this way?" Maya shook her head. "We're not sure. Our marine biologists have theories. Stress, from being separated from its pod, possibly an injury or illness affecting its behavior. But the truth is, we're in uncharted territory here." Gunnar was quiet, his gaze distant. When he spoke, his voice was low, almost reverent. "It was intelligent, Captain. The way it looked at me is it wasn't just an animal acting on instinct. There was something more." Maya nodded slowly. "Orcas are highly intelligent creatures, Mr. Magnusson. But this one, its behavior is unprecedented. We need to understand why before anyone else gets hurt. What are you going to do?" Inga asked, a note of fear in her voice. Maya straightened, her professional demeanor returning. "We're increasing patrols in the area, all water activities, diving, recreational boating, even commercial fishing, are being restricted until we can assess the full extent of the threat." "And the Orca?" Gunnar pressed. "What about it?" Maya met his gaze steadily. "Our priority is public safety, Mr. Magnusson. We're working with marine biology experts to determine the best course of action. If we can locate the Orca, we'll attempt to tranquilize and relocate it. But if it continues to pose a threat..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. The implication hung heavy in the air. Gunnar shook his head vehemently. "No, you can't kill it. It's not its fault. There must be a reason for its behavior." "Gunnar," Inga said softly, her voice tinged with disbelief. "It nearly killed you. How can you defend it?" Gunnar turned to his wife, his eyes intense. "You weren't there, Inga. You didn't see it. This creature, it's special, different. We can't just destroy it because we don't understand it." Maya watched the exchange with a mixture of sympathy and concern. She had seen this before. Survivors forming a strange attachment to the very things that had nearly killed them. But in Gunnar's case, she sensed it was something more. "Mr. Magnusson," she said gently, "I understand this is difficult. But I need you to understand the gravity of the situation. This Orca has demonstrated a clear pattern of aggressive behavior. If we can't contain or relocate it, we may have no choice." Gunnar's jaw clenched, a fire burning in his eyes that Maya hadn't seen before. "Then let me help," he said firmly. "What?" Inga exclaimed, shock evident in her voice. "Let me help." Gunnar repeated, turning to Maya. "I've encountered it. I might be able to provide insights your experts don't have." Maya shook her head. "Out of the question. You're injured, Mr. Magnusson. You need to focus on your recovery." "But I know these waters better than anyone," Gunnar insisted. "I've been diving here for decades, and I've seen this Orca up close. I can help you understand it." Inga stood, abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Have you lost your mind, Gunnar? You nearly died, and now you want to go back out there?" Gunnar reached for her hand, but Inga pulled away. "Inga, please try to understand. I can't just sit here and do nothing, not when I might be able to help prevent another attack." Maya watched the couple, conflict evident on both their faces. She understood Gunnar's desire to be involved, to make sense of what had happened to him, but she also knew the risks. "Mr. Magnusson," she said firmly, "I appreciate your offer, but it's simply not possible. You're not cleared medically, and the liability issues alone..." "To hell with liability," Gunnar interrupted, his voice rising. "We're talking about a creature's life here, about understanding something we've never encountered before. Isn't that worth the risk?" The room fell silent, the tension palpable. Maya looked from Gunnar to Inga, seeing the determination in one face and the fear in the other. She took a deep breath, weighing her options. "I can't allow you to participate in any field operations," she said finally. "That's non-negotiable. Fudaka, perhaps we could arrange for you to consult with our team, share your observations, help us understand what we're dealing with." Gunnar nodded eagerly. "Yes, anything, I just want to help." Inga turned away, her shoulders shaking slightly. Gunnar reached for her again, and this time she didn't pull away. "Inga, please, try to understand." She turned back, tears glistening in her eyes. "I do understand, Gunnar. That's what scares me. I see the look in your eyes when you talk about this creature. It's like it's calling to you somehow. And I'm afraid of where that call might lead you. Gunnar pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. I'm not going anywhere, Elsken, I promise. I just need to see this through. Maya stood, feeling like an intruder on a private moment. I'll make the arrangements, she said quietly. A member of our team will be in touch to debrief you fully, Mr. Magnusson. In the meantime, please focus on your recovery. As she turned to leave, Gunnar called out, Captain, thank you for listening, for understanding. Maya nodded, but her expression was grave. Don't thank me yet, Mr. Magnusson. This situation is far from resolved, and I fear it may get worse before it gets better. With that, she left, closing the door softly behind her. In the corridor, she leaned against the wall for a moment, the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. She had a feeling that involving Gunnar Magnusson in this investigation was either going to be the key to solving the mystery of the rogue Orca, or the biggest mistake of her career. As she walked, wait! Her phone buzzed with an incoming message. It was from Dr. Elena Peterson, the marine biologist consulting on the case. Maya's heart sank as she read the words on the screen. Another attack. Fishing boat off the north coast. No casualties, but significant damage. This is escalating. I need to act fast. Maya quickened her pace, her mind racing. The hunt for the rogue Orca had just become a race against time, and she couldn't shake the feeling that Gunnar Magnusson, with his strange connection to the creature, might be their only hope of preventing a tragedy. As she stepped out of the hospital into the chill Icelandic air, Maya looked out towards the harbor. The sea looked calm, peaceful, but she knew that beneath those deceptive waters a predator unlike any they had ever encountered was waiting, and somehow she had to find a way to stop it before it was too late. The morning sun cast a pale glow over the choppy waters of Husavik harbor as Captain Maja Nordstrom stepped onto the deck of the Coast Guard vessel. The air was crisp, carrying the familiar scent of salt and fish that permeated the coastal town. But today there was an undercurrent of tension that seemed to charge the very atmosphere. Status report, Maya barked as she strode towards the bridge, her eyes scanning the horizon. Lieutenant Eric Jensen fell into step beside her, his face grim. No new sightings since the attack on the fishing boat last night, Captain. But the local fishermen are getting restless. They're demanding we do something. Maya nodded, her jaw set in a tight line. And the scientists? Any progress on understanding why this orca is behaving so aggressively? Eric shook his head. Dr. Peterson and her team are still analyzing the data. They say they need more time. Time? There's something we don't have, Maya muttered as they entered the bridge. She turned to face her crew, her voice rising with authority. All right, listen up. I know everyone's on edge, but we need to stay focused. Our priority is to locate this orca, and if possible, tranquilize and relocate it. If that proves impossible... She paused, her voice heavy with the weight of the decision. We may have to consider more drastic measures. A murmur rippled through the assembled crew. Maya understood their unease. Orcas were beloved creatures in these waters, known for their intelligence and normally peaceful interactions with humans. The idea of having to harm one was unsettling, to say the least. Captain, a young officer spoke up, her voice hesitant. What about the diver, the one who survived the attack? Could he help us? Maya's mind flashed to Gunnar Magnusson, lying in his hospital bed, his eyes burning with an intensity she couldn't quite understand. Mr. Magnusson is still recovering, she said carefully. But yes, he'll be consulting with our team. His insights could prove valuable. As if on cue, Maya's phone buzzed. It was a message from the hospital. Gunnar had been cleared for release under strict orders to rest and attend physical therapy. But Maya knew the old diver well enough by now to know he wouldn't be content sitting idle while this crisis unfolded. Jensen, she called, prepare a briefing room, we'll be having a guest. An hour later, Gunnar Magnusson sat across from Maya in the small conference room aboard the Coast Guard vessel. His face was pale, lines of pain etched around his eyes. Despite the medication, but his gaze was sharp and focused. Thank you for coming, Mr. Magnusson, Maya began. I know you're still recovering, but we need your help. Gunnar nodded, his hands clasped tightly on the table before him. I want to help, Captain. Whatever it takes to understand why this happened, why this Orca is acting this way. Maya leaned forward, her voice low and urgent. "Mr. Magnusson, I need you to understand the gravity of the situation. This Orca has attacked again. A fishing boat this time. No one was hurt, but it was a close call. If we can't stop it, people will die." Gunner's face tightened, a mix of emotions flickering across his features. "I understand," he said softly, "but killing it should be the absolute last resort. There has to be a reason for its behavior." "That's what we're trying to figure out," Maya replied. "And that's where you come in. You're the only person who's had a close encounter with this Orca and survived. We need you to tell us everything you remember, every detail, no matter how small or insignificant it might seem." Gunner closed his eyes, his mind drifting back to that terrifying night beneath the waves. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. It was beautiful, terrifying, yes, but beautiful. The way it moved, so graceful and powerful, and its eyes, he opened his eyes, meeting Maya's gaze. There was intelligence there, Captain. Not just animal instinct, it was studying me as much as I was studying it. Maya leaned in, her interest piqued. "Did you notice anything unusual about its behavior? Anything that might indicate why it attacked?" Gunnar shook his head slowly. "It circled me for a while, almost curiously. The attack when it came was sudden, but..." He paused, his brow furrowed in concentration. "But what?" Maya pressed. "It felt deliberate. Not like a predator striking at prey, but like it was trying to communicate something." Maya sat back, her mind racing. This aligned with some of the theories Dr. Peterson had proposed, that the Orca's aggression might be a form of territorial behavior, or even an attempt at communication gone wrong. "Mr. Magnusson," she said carefully, "I know this might be difficult, but I need to ask, would you be willing to go back out on the water, not to dive?" She added quickly, seeing the alarm on his face, "but to assist our team in locating and observing the Orca. Your experience could be invaluable." Gunner's eyes widened, a mix of fear and excitement flashing across his face. Yes, I would." Just then, there was a commotion outside the conference room. The door burst open and Eric rushed in, his face flushed with urgency. "Captain, we've got a sighting. The Orca's been spotted near the mouth of the fjord." Maya was on her feet in an instant. "Prepare to move out. Full team, tranquilizer equipment, everything." She turned to Gunnar. "Mr. Magnusson, if you're sure about this, we could use you on deck, but I need to know you can handle it." Gunnar stood, wincing slightly as he put weight on his injured leg. "I'm ready, Captain. Let's find this Orca." As they made their way to the deck, Maya couldn't shake a feeling of unease. They were venturing into uncharted waters, both literally and figuratively. The unpredictable behavior of this Orca had thrown all their usual protocols into disarray. The vessel cut through the waves, the tension on board palpable. Crew members checked and rechecked equipment, their movements quick and precise. Gunnar stood at the railing, his eyes scanning the water, a complex mix of emotions playing across his face. Suddenly a shout went up from the lookout. "Dorsal fin! 3 o'clock, about 500 meters out." All eyes turned to where a sleek black fin cut through the water, moving with purposeful speed directly towards the boat. "It's coming right for us," Eric muttered, his hand instinctively moving to the tranquilizer gun at his side. Maya's mind raced, weighing their options. They needed to get close enough to attempt tranquilization, but not so close as to put the crew in danger. "Hold steady," she ordered. "Let it come to us." As the Orca drew nearer, Gunnar gripped the railing tighter, his knuckles white. "There," he said, his voice tight with a mix of fear and awe. "The scar, it's the same one." Maya saw it too, a long pale mark just behind the dorsal fin. This was definitely their rogue Orca. The massive creature surfaced about 100 meters from the boat, its blowhole expelling a misty spray. For a moment it seemed to regard them, its intelligent eye fixed on the vessel. "Steady," Maya called, seeing several crew members raise their tranquilizer guns. "Wait for my signal." But before she could give the order, the Orca dove, disappearing. Beneath the waves, where did it go? Eric asked, his voice tense. The answer came a moment later as the boat shuddered violently. The Orca had rammed them from below. "Brace yourselves," Maya shouted as the boat rocked dangerously. Gunnar stumbled, crying out in pain as his injured leg buckled beneath him. Maya rushed to his side, helping him up. "Are you all right?" Gunnar nodded grimly, his eyes fixed on the water. "It's trying to capsize us," he said, his voice filled with a strange mix of fear and admiration. The orca surfaced again, closer this time. Maya could see the intelligence in its eye, the deliberate nature of its actions. This was no mindless attack. The creature was testing them, probing for weaknesses. "We need to tranquilize it now," Eric urged, raising his gun. But Gunnar suddenly pushed forward, his voice rising above the chaos. "Wait, look!" The orca had surfaced again, but this time it wasn't charging. Instead, it seemed to be waiting. Its eye was fixed on Gunnar, a look of what could almost be described as recognition in its gaze. "It remembers me," Gunnar breathed, his voice filled with wonder. Maya watched, torn between her duty to protect her crew and a growing sense that they were on the verge of understanding something profound. The orca's behavior was unlike anything she had ever encountered in her years with the Coast Guard. "Mr. Magnusson," she said quietly, "what do you think it wants?" Gunnar shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving the orca. "I don't know, but I think it's trying to tell us something." As if in response to his words, the orca let out a haunting call, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very air around them. Then, with a powerful flick of its tail, it dove deep, disappearing from view. The tension on the deck was palpable as everyone waited, expecting another attack. But minutes passed, and the orca did not reappear. "Where did it go?" Eric asked, scanning the waves. Maya turned to Gunnar, who was still staring out at the spot where the orca had vanished, a look of intense concentration on his face. "Mr. Magnusson," she prompted gently. Gunnar turned to her, his eyes wide with a sudden realization. "It's leading us somewhere," he said, his voice filled with certainty. "We need to follow it." Maya hesitated, weighing the risks. Following a potentially dangerous creature into unknown waters went against every protocol. But she also knew that they were dealing with something unprecedented. Sometimes in uncharted waters, you had to trust your instincts. "Plot its last known course," she ordered, turning to her navigation officer. "We're going to follow it." As the boat changed direction, following the orca's path, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the verge of discovering something that would change their understanding of these magnificent creatures forever. Whether that discovery would lead to peace or to further conflict, only time would tell. The hunt for the rogue orca had become a journey into the unknown, guided by the unlikely partnership of a seasoned sea captain, a wounded diver, and a mysterious creature that seemed to bridge the gap between their worlds. As they sailed deeper into the fjord, the mist closing in around them, Maya sent up a silent prayer that they were making the right choice. The Coast Guard vessel cut through the misty waters of the fjord, its engines humming with a low, steady vibration. Captain Maya Nordstrom stood at the helm, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the elusive orca. Beside her, Gunnar Magnusson gripped the railing, his face a mix of anticipation and apprehension. "Are you sure about this, Mr. Magnusson?" Maya asked, her voice low enough that only Gunnar could hear. "It's not too late to turn back." Gunnar shook his head, his eyes never leaving the water. "No, Captain. We need to see this through. I can't explain it, but I know this is important." Maya nodded, respecting the old diver's determination, even as she worried about the wisdom of their current course. Following a potentially dangerous creature into the depths of the fjord went against every protocol she'd ever learned. But these were unprecedented circumstances, and sometimes leadership meant taking calculated risks. "Any sign of it, Jensen?" Maya called to her first officer, who was manning the sonar equipment. Eric Jensen shook his head, frustration evident in his voice. "Nothing yet, Captain. It's like it vanished into thin air or water, I suppose." As if in response to his words, a haunting call echoed across the water. Everyone on deck froze, their eyes scanning the waves. "There!" Gunnar shouted, pointing to a disturbance in the water about 100 meters off the port bow. The orca surfaced, gracefully, its black and white form gleaming in the pale light. It seemed to regard the boat for a moment, its intelligent eye fixed on them, before diving back beneath the waves. "It's toying with us," Eric muttered, his hand instinctively moving to the tranquilizer gun at his side. But Gunnar shook his head. No, it's not toying, it's leading us. Maya raised an eyebrow. Leading us where, Mr. Magnuson? Before Gunnar could respond, the boat suddenly shuddered. A collective gasp went up from the crew as they realized the Orca was now directly beneath them, close enough that they could see its massive form through the clear water. Steady, Maya called, seeing the panic rising in some of her younger crew members' eyes. It's not attacking, just observing. For several tense moments, the Orca kept pace with the boat, swimming just beneath the surface. Then with a powerful flick of its tail, it shot forward, leaving them behind. Follow it, Gunnar urged, his voice tight with excitement. Quickly, before we lose it again. Maya hesitated for only a second before giving the order. Helm, adjust. Course, follow that Orca, but maintain a safe distance. As they navigated deeper into the fjord, the mist grew thicker, reducing visibility to mere meters in front of the boat. The mood on deck was tense, every crew member straining their eyes and ears for any sign of their enigmatic guide. Captain, Eric said, his voice low and urgent, we're entering uncharted waters. Our maps don't cover this area in detail. Maya felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. They were venturing into the unknown in more ways than one. But something, in Gunnar's certainty, in the deliberate behavior of the Orca, told her they needed to press on. Proceed with caution, she ordered. Sonar on full. I want to know about every rock and reef well before we reach it. As they pushed further into the mist, the fjord began to narrow. Steep cliffs rose on either side, their tops lost in the low-hanging clouds. The water grew calmer, almost unnaturally still. Suddenly, Gunnar gasped. Look, there, in the cliff face. Maya squinted through the mist. At first, she saw nothing but sheer rock. Then, as they drew closer, she realized what Gunnar had spotted. There, almost hidden by an overhanging ledge, was the dark mouth of a cave. It's leading us there, Gunnar said, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and trepidation. Maya frowned. A sea cave. But why? Before anyone could speculate further, the Orca surfaced again, right in front of the cave entrance. It let out another haunting call, the sound echoing off the cliff walls before disappearing into the darkness of the cave. Captain, Eric said, his voice tense. We can't follow it in there. The boat's too large, and we have no idea what's inside. Maya nodded, her mind racing. They had followed the Orca this far, but now they had reached an impasse, or had they? She turned to Gunnar, seeing the determination in his eyes. Mr. Magnuson, I know what you're thinking, and the answer is no. You're not going in there. Gunnar met her gaze steadily. With all due respect, Captain, I don't think we have a choice. We've come this far. Whatever the Orca wants us to see, it's in that cave. It's too dangerous, Maya argued. You're still recovering from your injuries, and we have no idea what's in there. Which is exactly why I need to go, Gunnar countered. I'm the only one who's had close contact with this Orca. It knows me somehow. If anyone has a chance of understanding what it wants, it's me. Maya looked from Gunnar to the cave and back, weighing their options. Every instinct told her not to let a civilian, especially an injured one, take such a risk. But she also knew that they were far beyond the realm of standard procedures. All right, she said finally, her voice heavy with the weight of the decision. But you're not going alone. Jensen, prepare the small Zodiac. You'll accompany Mr. Magnuson. Eric nodded, though Maya could see the apprehension in his eyes. As the crew prepared the small boat, Maya pulled Gunnar aside. Are you absolutely sure about this? She asked, her voice low and urgent. Gunnar nodded, his eyes fixed on the cave entrance. I've never been more sure of anything in my life, Captain. I can't explain it, but I know this is important. Not just for us, but for understanding these creatures. Maya studied him for a moment, seeing the mix of fear and determination in his weathered face. All right, but you follow Jensen's lead in there. At the first sign of danger, you turn back. Understood. Understood, Captain, Gunnar agreed. As Gunnar and Eric climbed into the Zodiac, Maya felt a sense of foreboding wash over her. She was sending her first officer and a civilian into unknown danger, based on nothing more than a hunch and the strange behavior of a creature they barely understood. Be careful in there, she called, as the small boat pulled away. And Jensen, keep your radio on at all times. I want updates every 5 minutes. Eric nodded, his face set in grim determination as he steered the Zodiac towards the cave entrance. As the small boat disappeared into the darkness, swallowed by the mist and the looming cliff face, Maya turned to her remaining crew. "Prepare. Search and rescue equipment," she ordered. "If we don't hear from them in 30 minutes, we're going in after them." The wait that followed was one of the longest of Maya's career. Each minute seemed to stretch into an eternity as she strained her ears for any sound from the cave. The radio remained stubbornly silent, save for Eric's brief, tense check-ins. All clear, proceeding deeper, and no sign of the Orca yet. As the 30-minute mark approached, Maya felt her anxiety reaching a fever pitch. She was just about to give the order to prepare a rescue team when the radio crackled to life. "Captain!" Eric's voice was breathless, filled with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "You're not going to believe this. We've found... My God, I don't even know how to describe it. You need to see this for yourself." Maya's heart raced. "Jensen, what is it? Are you in danger?" There was a pause, filled only with the sound of heavy breathing and what might have been a distant echo. "No danger, Captain," Eric replied finally. "But this changes everything. We're coming out now, and Captain, you might want to contact Dr. Peterson. We're going to need a whole team of marine biologists for this." As Eric's voice faded, replaced by static, Maya turned to look at the cave entrance. Whatever Gunnar and Eric had found in there, she had. A feeling it was just the beginning of a much larger discovery, one that could change their understanding of orcas, and perhaps the entire marine ecosystem forever. The mist seemed to thicken around the boat, as if nature itself was holding its breath in anticipation. In the distance, barely audible over the lapping of waves against the hull, Maya thought she heard the haunting call of the Orca once more. It sounded almost triumphant. As she waited for the Zodiac to emerge from the cave, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the threshold of something monumental. The hunt for the rogue Orca had led them not to a conclusion, but to the beginning of a new chapter in their relationship with these mysterious and intelligent creatures. Whatever came next, Maya knew that nothing would ever be quite the same. Again, the waters they had entered, both literally and figuratively, were uncharted, and in those depths, wonders and dangers beyond their imagination were waiting to be discovered. Gunnar Magnusson sat in the small office of Dr. Olafur Jonsson, his injured leg propped up on a chair. The room was cluttered with medical texts and anatomical models, but Gunnar's eyes were fixed on the window, gazing out at the harbor where fishing boats bobbed gently in the late afternoon sun. Dr. Jonsson entered, a tablet in hand and a serious expression on his face. "Mr. Magnusson," he said, taking a seat behind his desk, "how are you feeling today?" Gunnar tore his gaze from the window, offering a wan smile. "As well as can be expected, I suppose. The pain is manageable." The doctor nodded, his eyes scanning the information on his tablet. "I've got your latest test results here. The good news is that there's no sign of infection. The antibiotics have done their job." "And the bad news?" Gunnar asked, bracing himself. Dr. Jonsson sighed, setting the tablet down. "The damage to your leg is extensive, Mr. Magnusson. The bite tore through several major muscle groups and nicked an artery. We've repaired what we can, but..." He trailed off, and Gunnar felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. "But what, Doctor?" "You're looking at a long recovery period," Dr. Jonsson said gently. "Months of physical therapy at the very least. And even then, there's no guarantee you'll regain full function." Gunnar's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white. "What are you saying exactly?" The doctor met his gaze steadily. "I'm saying that you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that you may never dive again, Mr. Magnusson, at least not professionally." The words hit Gunnar like a physical blow. Diving wasn't just his profession, it was his life, his passion. The thought of never again feeling the embrace of the sea, of never exploring its depths, it was almost unbearable. "There has to be something more we can do," Gunnar said, his voice tight with emotion. "Surely with enough therapy, enough time..." Dr. Jonsson held up a hand. "I'm not saying it's impossible, Mr. Magnusson, but I need you to understand the reality of your situation. This isn't a simple injury. The Orca's teeth did significant damage. You're lucky to be alive, let alone to still have your leg." Gunnar nodded slowly, the full weight of his situation settling over him. "So what happens now?" Now we focus on your recovery, Dr. Janssen said, his tone becoming more businesslike. I'm prescribing a course of physical therapy, 3 times a week to start. We'll reassess in a month and see how you're progressing. As the doctor continued outlining the treatment plan, Gunnar found his mind drifting. He thought of the Orca, of its intelligent eye regarding him, in those terrifying moments underwater. Despite everything, he couldn't bring himself to hate the creature. It was simply following its nature, acting on instincts honed over millions of years of evolution. Mr. Magnusson? Dr. Janssen's voice snapped Gunnar back to the present. Did you hear what I said? Gunnar shook his head apologetically. I'm sorry, Doctor, my mind was elsewhere. The doctor's expression softened with understanding. I said that it's important for you to have a support system during your recovery. Is there someone who can help you at home? Family, perhaps? Gunnar nodded. My wife, Inga. She's been by my side through all of this. Good, Dr. Janssen said. You're going to need that support. This won't be an easy journey, Mr. Magnusson. There will be good days and bad days. It's important to stay positive, but also to be realistic about the challenges ahead. As Gunnar left the doctor's office, leaning heavily on his crutches, he felt a mix of emotions churning within him. There was fear, certainly. Fear of the long road ahead, of the possibility that he might never fully recover. But there was also a strange sense of purpose, a feeling that his encounter with the Orca had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. Outside, Inga was waiting for him, her face a mask of concern. What did the doctor say? She asked as soon as Gunnar emerged. Gunnar took a deep breath, steeling himself. It's not good, Elsken. The damage is significant. He says I might never dive again. Inga's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. Oh, Gunnar, I'm so sorry. She wrapped her arms around him, careful of his injured leg, and Gunnar allowed himself to lean into her embrace. For a moment they stood there in silence, the weight of the news settling over them both. Finally, Gunnar pulled back, meeting Inga's gaze. It's not over yet, though. There's still hope. It'll be a long recovery, but... Inga nodded, wiping away her tears. But we'll face it together. Whatever happens, Gunnar, we'll get through this. As they made their way slowly to the car, Gunnar's thoughts returned to the Orca. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the attack than simple predator instinct. The way it had looked at him, the intelligence in its eye. Inga, he said suddenly, pausing. I need to tell you something about the Orca. Inga turned to him, her brow furrowed with concern. What is it? Gunnar hesitated, knowing how strange it would sound. When it attacked me, it wasn't just hunting. It was like it was trying to communicate something. I can't explain it, but I feel like there's more to this story, something we're missing. Inga studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she sighed. Gunnar, you've been through a traumatic experience. It's natural to try to find meaning in it, but this isn't just trauma talking, Gunnar insisted. I know it sounds crazy, but I can't shake this feeling. There's something more going on here, and I need to find out what it is. Inga's face tightened with worry. Gunnar, please, you need to focus on your recovery now. Leave the Orca to the marine biologists and the Coast Guard. But Gunnar shook his head, a determination settling over him. I can't, Inga. I'm sorry. But I can't just let this go. I need to understand why this happened. And I think I might be the only one who can. As they drove home in silence, the tension between them was palpable. Gunnar knew he was asking a lot of Inga, knew that his obsession with the Orca was putting a strain on their relationship, but he couldn't let it go. The memory of those moments, underwater, of the Orca's intelligent gaze, haunted him. That night, as Inga slept beside him, Gunnar lay awake, his mind racing. He thought about the long recovery ahead, about the possibility that he might never dive again. But more than that, he thought about the Orca. What had it been trying to tell him? Why had it attacked, only to let him go? As the first light of dawn began to creep through the window, Gunnar made a decision. He would recover, would throw himself into his physical therapy with everything he had. But he would also seek answers. He would find out why the Orca had attacked him, what it had been trying to communicate, even if it meant risking everything, his recovery, his relationship with Inga, perhaps even his life. Gunnar knew he had to see this through. The encounter with the Orca had changed him, had awakened something within him that he couldn't ignore. As he finally drifted off to sleep, Gunnar's dreams were filled with swirling water and haunting whale song. And through it all, the Orca's eye watched him, intelligent and inscrutable, holding secrets that Gunnar was determined to uncover. The journey ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, both physical and emotional, but Gunnar was ready to face them. For in the depths of his fear and pain he had found a new purpose, and he would not rest until he understood the message hidden in the Orca's haunting gaze.